you to everyone who's here today for taking the time to be with us, and then especially for Pamela for taking the time to be with us. I know you have a busy schedule, so fully appreciate all the time and effort that you're making. I know so many, at least we got, in terms of feedback, they're very interested to hear about mindfulness in the workplace. And there's a lot of enthusiasm, I think, in general around this topic. So very excited to have you here. And I think a lot of the attendees who are here probably know, but so online Tibetan education, we started back in 2011 with the mission to preserve and promote the Tibetan culture. We've been doing that, so since 2011, and we do that through our Tibetan language classes, online Buddhism classes, annual retreats that we host, and then Lhakar Series is one that we added to the list since late last year into this year. So every month we try to host a topic on a session on different topics that's outside of the Tibetan language or the Tibetan religion section. So happy to have you here. And so before I start, we'll just let everyone know that today's format will be slightly different. It'll be more so like a fireside chat where, Pamela and I, we can just have a quick conversation around mindfulness in the workplace. And then we'll open it up to everyone for Q&A later in the session. So if you have any questions that, maybe you don't feel comfortable asking directly, please feel free to put them in the chat box. We can ask those questions. Or if you just want to unmute yourself and ask a question, we're comfortable with that too. So before we start, just we'll provide a quick introduction or a bio on Pamela. So Pema Sharpa was born and raised in Nepal. She's been training in mindfulness principles for over 2 decades now. She received her master's from Harvard University and combines her background in psychology and philosophy to research mindfulness at NYU. She's also the founder of Pema Solutions, a platform through which she provides mindfulness-informed well-being and performance training to corporations. In her work, she also borrows from psychology and also the robust philosophical wisdom of mindfulness tradition. And I think that's a great way to kind of start the conversation as well. So I was hoping, I know I provided a very high-level brief bio of you, but I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about yourself and then also how you got into the Pema Solutions journey.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. You said a lot of kind things about me. So it's always a very daunting question, task to start introducing yourself or say more about yourself, I guess. But in relation to how I got to starting Pema Solutions has to do a little bit with the fact that, of course, I was born and raised in Nepal. So I had the opportunity to learn and practice mindfulness at a very young age. And I've always had this interest to understand the mind, which sort of took me to this journey of studying psychology as my undergrad. And then for my graduate school, I went into studying mind from a more philosophical perspective. And I was in the track to go into PhD and continue in the more scholarship journey. But I found that I was not entirely satisfied with just doing the theoretical work. And even as I was in grad school, I was doing a bunch of projects, working in hospitals, teaching mindfulness. And I had the opportunity to mentor under a very amazing teacher in Boston who was Tibetan. So I knew that that was something that I enjoyed. So I found a happy medium as I found this lab at NYU where I could continue to pursue my intellectual curiosity, but also be able to make myself more useful in a practical sense. And that sort of gave way to starting Pema Solutions.
Nice, that's great to hear. And also, you mentioned NYU and doing research work over there. So as you're starting, and when you first started on this journey, maybe also just asking a general question to surface everyone too. What is the definition of meditation and what is mindfulness? I'm sure many of us know here, but it's also kind of good to segue those a little bit because I know there can be interconnectedness between the two, right?
Absolutely. You'd be amazed, actually, when you really think about, we all have a general sense of what meditation is, but a lot of times it's not exactly clear. So I'll try to give my version of the introduction. So meditation, one can think of it as an exercise for the mind. Our minds are often distracted by external distractions in the form of work or entertainment, or internal distractions in the form of thoughts about the future or the past. And meditation, rather than allowing our minds to go into any which direction, is an exercise of directing the attention and awareness to the present moment. And normally the way we do it is by giving it something to focus on, whether it's your breath or just open awareness. And that allows our mind to sort of stay here, but naturally would get distracted, and constantly you bring it back to the present moment. And mindfulness is very much related, but mindfulness in some ways is the state of being aware of what's happening in our environment, in ourselves, in our mind. Just that awareness. If I clapped, you know that you heard something. That is mindfulness in some ways. And when we allow our minds to be a little bit more directed towards the present moment, mindfulness becomes more productive and possible.
Definitely. And I think also in general, just being more present, being more aware, right? It's important. And along that line, so I wanted to ask you, like, how important is it when we're practicing meditation or kind of mindfulness to set intent or our intentions? Is that important, or is it just no, as long as you're kind of want to be present, be aware in the moment, that's good?
Yeah, intention is a very interesting aspect. So two ways we can think of it. If we have this very clear way of what exactly we want to get out of meditation, perhaps it could be not very productive, because so many times, even in the Buddhist philosophy, all the scholars don't speak in positive. They always speak in negation. It is not this, it is not that, you know, they never say it is this. So having a very clear intent on exactly what we want to do in meditation is perhaps in some ways self-defeating. But in terms of intention in general, outside of meditation, or like the bigger overarching intention, that's definitely productive, because if we don't have a general sense of where we are going, of course, getting to the destination is not only difficult, perhaps not possible. I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah, definitely. And I was gonna kind of transition a little bit from just general intention into now, you know, through Pema Solutions, right? What you do is you provide training to corporations. So how do you bring that when you provide training to corporations, and what do you see out there?
So for my own personal intention, I have my own personal agenda in terms of maintaining the, let's say, lineage or the tradition of mindfulness, and sort of maintaining that integrity that mindfulness holds beyond being just a source of, for the lack of words, zenning out or relaxing. So for me, that's definitely a very big part of my personal agenda. But also knowing that meditation and mindfulness can be so productive in helping people reach their goals, whether it has to do with performance or well-being in a more sustainable way. So my goal is to make sure that I'm able to provide that. And sometimes we do have a very clear definition of what that looks like, and other times I get to sort of define it. So I do always have the intention to, one, serve them, but also serve Dharma, let's say. I can say that in this context.
Definitely. And when you say like serving them, how are you serving them? And when you're providing trainings, what are you seeing out there in terms of what corporations are really looking for?
So a lot of times, especially with people I'm working with, mindfulness is such a new topic to them. It's in a lot of ways, it's I who define what the program looks like, what they can expect out of it. So I've been lucky enough that people are open-minded, and the fact that somebody wants to hire me, and the fact that these employees are signing up to be part of the programs. I normally, my programs are sort of closed program, where once they are signed up, they are locked in for extended period of time. So the fact that they want to put in that work, already they're open-minded. So I do have that benefit of working with people who already come into it having wanted it. So my goal is to just serve them with the right content, convince them in their language, so that going outside of the training, they actually apply it into their day-to-day life.
Got it. Okay. And then I was wondering if, you talked a little bit about your work, but if you could provide maybe like specific examples. So what does it look like? So let's say I work for, I don't know, Google, I'm just making it up, and then you're coming and training us on implicit bias. Like what do you do? Like, what's the process do you take us through?
So the implicit bias is a different offering, and the mindfulness. So my program that I offer is called Mindful Performance Training.
Mhm.
So that is a little bit different than implicit bias. With implicit bias, I have come up with a format which goes around, number one, awareness of bias. So just examining your bias within and externally. The second step I have is removing stigma associated with bias so that we understand that bias is an unintentional habit that's ineffective rather than being an intentional evil that we put it to be. And finally, we talk about mindful ways of outsmarting your bias. It's not so much about whether or not one has bias, it's about knowing that there is a natural tendency for bias and how can we use mindfulness to correct it. And it's not just mindfulness in a sense of there's no meditation involved. It's more about using the social psychological understanding of bias and people's behavior paired with mindfulness understanding of mind and how we form and break habits. So I take them through the training. Normally, if I'm doing it virtually, they come in and it's a mix of interactive breakout rooms or me just talking at them.
Got it. And then, so in terms of like interactive, do you ask questions in terms of, okay, if you were, I don't know, let's say, whatever different scenario it is, do you kind of walk them through and you say, answer this question, is it this or that?
Yeah. So it's mostly sort of giving them prompts that they can go. And so there are group discussions where I just ask a question and people volunteer to answer. And other times I give them scenarios and prompts so they can go into their breakout room and discuss with the other peers and come out and share it. And we go back and forth, sort of deconstructing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then another thing I wanted to ask too, as you're kind of providing this training, you mentioned like kind of mindfulness training, right? Mindfulness. Have you seen, and based on your research too at NYU, like how does mindfulness actually help employees in the workplace manage their emotions? So especially when they're going through stressful times, how do we use it to kind of help us manage our emotions and keep it under control?
So it has huge implications, and we are lucky that we are at a time where there has been such robust philosophical growth, research growth in the field of mindfulness and meditation. So literally we know what are the parts of the brain that are getting triggered when we meditate and what implication it has on stress, anxiety, and even pro-social behavior and performance, focus, all of that. So being able to take that and then contextualize it for people, it makes it very much more easier for people to grab on it. And one of the things is with employees and organizations, people outside, one of the most defining feature of today's generation is the fact that we live in a time when our environment is actively vying for our attention. So we don't actually have to go out there for distraction. It's coming at us and it's not going to stop. So at the same time, our brains have not evolved to be able to thrive or perhaps even survive in this kind of world. So mindfulness allows us to internally make us more resilient to the distraction, the demand, the stress that's coming our way. So it has huge implications on our well-being as well as our performance because of that reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think, these days we're very easily distracted, right? And you think about social media, Instagram, Facebook, and constant notifications on our phone, it's hard not to stay focused and aware and be present in the moment. We're continuously looking for that next thing, like, oh, what else is out there? Oh,
yeah,
this is happening and that's happening. So
absolutely. I like to think of it as, when you go on Wikipedia, there's so many blue hyperlinks. You could endlessly go into those hyperlinks forever. But when we meditate, in some ways, we see them. It's not like they don't exist anymore, but we have now the agency to choose whether or not you want to go into that hole. And there are times when you perhaps have to do it and you're aware, you're doing it more intentionally rather than impulsively, completely on an autopilot.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah, I think so. And you mentioned kind of Wikipedia, and I just remember I always click on all the links because you want to make sure you're reading every single thing, but then you never have time to
and
actually read it.
It's impossible. Yeah. And then at the end, like sometimes it happens. You've been going through that internet hole for the longest time and you stop yourself and think, what was I doing for all that time? Literally, you have not consumed much information that is going to stay. And that's a scary thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And so kind of sticking with the workplace itself, the topic itself, I wanted to ask you too, in terms of your research that you've done at NYU, right, on mindfulness and also just your work in general, how do you find that like mindful leaders in general make for better leaders? And is that one reason why a lot more corporations are now kind of going that route?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things, the most amazing thing about mindfulness and meditation is it gives us some level of maturity and wisdom that in other ways, our school system, our upbringing, particularly in the West, does not foster that. So with mindfulness, we have the opportunity to sort of separate yourself from the patterns so that you can grow out of it. And also this whole idea of being able to be in the present, have better communication, be more benevolent in some ways, helps you become better leader, because when you're more outwardly focused, you are only able to communicate better, care for the growth as well as the performance of your subordinates, and that really does have a huge impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and how can we, I guess maybe if you can share some tips as well, like how can we make sure that on a daily basis or a continuous basis we are kind of doing that exactly, kind of being mindful and making sure that we're not kind of just making decisions based on kind of what's out there.
So one, meditation, definitely something, if we incorporate it into our day to day, even if we're doing it 5 or 10 minutes, the return on investment is just so much that it's a no-brainer. We have to do it. But then it's not so much the question of whether or not we want to do it. It's about how do we actually do it when tomorrow comes through and we have to make it happen. And one of the things I've realized as I get older and older and as I keep working with people is motivation and inspiration. If we rely on the whim of that, nothing is ever going to get done. So unless you schedule it and then show up when that schedule, whenever that is scheduled, you won't do it. So my approach, I share the 5-step strategy to actually get yourself to meditate is: number 1, start small. Because research has shown that with meditation, meditating for a short period of time regularly every day is much more beneficial than meditating for a long time on a one-off occasion. So starting small is really a great way to set yourself up for success, because 2 minutes, who doesn't have 2 minutes? Then you grow on to 5 minutes or 10 minutes. So starting small is really important. And then you scan through your day and find a time where, without exception, you can meditate for those 5 minutes. Let's say if that is 7 a.m. in the morning, right out of shower, and whatever that time is for you. And then you want to set some sort of reminder on your phone, because that way you're delegating and externalizing that job of remembering, so that forgetting is not going to be yet another obstacle. And then when that reminder goes off on the day of, you absolutely do not negotiate with yourself, because anything is, of course, more exciting than sitting still without any stimulation. So whether with excitement or with the resistance, you just want to sit down to meditate. And when you do that, you want to use some sort of timer so that you're setting a boundary, so that you don't have to constantly think about, oh, how long has passed since I started meditating? And of course, you also don't want to meditate too long and affect your schedule. And then when you're done meditating, you give yourself a small reward, and it could be a nice cup of coffee, or it could be that feeling of accomplishment you get when you do something truly beneficial for yourself, or do something that you set your mind on. So once you do that every day, what you do is you take the decision aspect out of the routine. So every day you don't have to decide all over again. You decide once and that's it. And you just follow through, and it does become a very almost effortless habit. For, I don't know, any of you who has exercise as a routine, even if you don't enjoy it, you feel weird when you don't do it. So we want to do the same with meditation.
Yeah, definitely. I've been on that. And it's hard to also kind of create these habits, right? Like you're like, okay, I'm going to meditate every day, even 2 minutes. Like it seems doable, it seems easy enough, but then somehow it's still difficult to find 2 minutes.
Yeah, so schedule. If it's not on your schedule, it's not going to get done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also along those lines, like, I mean, other than meditation, are there other ways that we can cultivate mindfulness?
Yes. So one of the killers of being present and being mindful is multitasking, right? So we're constantly, a big culprit in today's time is the quote unquote harmless phone. We're always multitasking with our phones. And research has shown that multitasking is not even a thing. When we are multitasking, we're actually not doing several things simultaneously. We're actually switching between tasks, which is why it feels pretty awful, because it depletes us mentally and not much gets done. So challenging yourself to monotask is a great way to go about it. And to start with, perhaps creating a healthy boundary with your phones, and by keeping it away, or by setting time on when you can use it, because now we've come to a point where it's not so much about whether or not I multitask. It's about how do I stop it? Because at this point, we're not doing it because we want to be more productive. We're doing it because with habit, we're sort of have no agency. So monotasking is a really great way to be more mindful, and doing the same thing that we do with meditation. For a few moments, all you're doing is sitting down and meditating, focusing on your breath, right? We can do the same with our tasks. Let's say you are studying, rather than having your phone, glimpsing, like looking here, looking there, rather than doing that, setting a boundary, saying 1 hour, all I'm going to do is I'm going to study, set a timer, and then you just focus on that task for an hour. And of course, because of habit, we're going to have those urge to check your phone or social media. And then at that moment, just like in meditation, seeing that as just a distraction that you don't have to engage with. It's just that blue hyperlink. You can choose not to click it and then go back and keep going back. And as you do that, with neuroplasticity, you literally train your mind to be able to sustain your focus for a longer period of time, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, definitely. And I also wanted to ask, like, another question is, so we talk about mindfulness, we talk about being in the moment, and there are a lot of different benefits to it, right? What are some other benefits that maybe are not necessarily talked about as much that you're finding in your research?
So not so much in my research, let's say, because one of the few things that we know about meditation is the impact it has on different parts of the brain. But just coming from a more the philosophical aspect of what we can gain with our understanding of mindfulness, that is not so much researched upon at this time. And that is that curiosity of getting to understand your mind, on not just a sense of, oh, when do I feel angry? When do I not feel angry? Not just that, but beyond it. And that's, again, that's something we can't put an answer saying, oh, you will find this or that, because we don't know, right? But going from a very curious perspective, rather than having a very strict idea of, I want to get my grade up by certain points, I want to do that, or I want to stop feeling anxious. And all those goals are amazing, but it's sort of a ripoff if we are just going for those physical and performance-oriented benefits, when meditation has so much to offer in terms of getting to know ourselves and like almost even transcending beyond just the worldly sense of what is there to gain. So that is definitely something not talked about enough in a Western context, that perhaps we have to go back into more the Dharma perspective in order to gain that understanding.
Yeah, and what you're mentioning in terms of Dharma perspective too, I wanted to ask you a question in terms of that. When you're going out there and training and talking to people about mindfulness, meditation, for many of us, at least from an online Tibetan education OTE perspective, we've been focusing on mindfulness and meditation from a Buddhist perspective, like, right? So when you're out there and you're talking to people who are not necessarily Buddhist, like how do you communicate with them, and do you ever bring that aspect to it?
So in terms of bringing my aspect of the religious and spiritual background, I don't do that because, one, I find it not very productive because that's not our common ground with which we can grow. And another thing is, in some ways, it's really not necessary because we're working at a state of, the level we are working with is something we can speak in a very secular fashion. And in some ways, when you really think, even of Dharma perspective, it's a very secular religion. So taking it from a more philosophical perspective. But normally when I talk to people, our common ground is performance, return on investment, as well as the psychological, the neuroscientific aspect of meditation. So I feel like that ground is productive enough that I really don't have to bring in my own personal opinion about spirituality or dharma in it.
Yeah. Okay, that's good, because I think many times we're like, oh, meditation, it's like comes from Langche, right? Like Buddhism, Dharma. So we always think about that, but it's nice. And you see a lot more people now accepting and kind of practicing meditation, mindfulness outside of just the religious perspective. So I also just want to let anyone in the audience, like if you have any questions, you can like raise your hand or put it in the chat box, or just let us know and you can unmute yourself and ask a question. So I kind of have one more question that I was going to ask, just in general, maybe more specifically on your work. I know you talked a little bit about it, but there are many of us who are very interested, right, in meditation, mindfulness, but it's hard for us to kind of take that leap into, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to start something because I have a lot to offer. What gave you that courage to kind of go on that journey?
So one thing I will say is with business, you're never ready. You never feel ready until you actually do it. But I was lucky enough that my partner, he has the big business background and he had just started his business a year before I did. So I really had that idea of, okay, this A, B, and C, this is what I have to do. And we don't all necessarily need that. That sort of saved me a lot of trial and errors that I would probably have to do if I didn't have him. But even just with yourself, one, you never feel ready enough to do it. Two, no matter what field you're in, no matter what service you're providing, when you start a business, you have to do the sales, the marketing, the hustle aspect of it. It just comes with the territory. So I never thought, as somebody who's from a very academic background, I never thought of a profession where I'm constantly selling my ideas, having meetings, doing proposals. There's so much that goes into building and maintaining and growing a business that we really have to sort of learn a lot of things. But the fun thing is you get to learn all these things, because why would you learn it unless you absolutely have to? So just knowing that it's a business, doesn't matter what service you're providing, you have to do the nitty-gritty work of building a business. I don't know if I actually answered anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're also saying is like fear, right? Many of us, we don't choose to go that route because of this fear of the unknown, what's going to happen out there. But I know for sure, a lot of people, especially from the other sessions on mindfulness that we've hosted as well, there's a lot of interest in this, but we don't see as many kind of people out there who are actually doing this work, right? So it's inspiring to see someone like you out there doing
Thank you. And that's one thing too, is a lot of times all the limitations we've put on ourselves is we do it ourselves. It's not actually an objective limitation that we can't pass. So if you're willing to be uncomfortable, which you have to be, and honestly, like even going back to when I started, I never thought I had to learn how to make small talk. Literally, I would have to go into meetings with clients, writing down things like talk about weather and talk about where they're from and things like that didn't come naturally to me, because I don't know, maybe Nepali people don't do small talk, or I don't know what that is. I was not well equipped with that. I had to teach myself not to be this awkward person. And that's really fine. You sort of have to do that. Just because in the beginning you can't make a conversation or build a rapport doesn't mean that you're not going to be able to. Anyone who does that is able to do that because they had to go through that learning curve. So all those little things go into building a business. But if you have specific questions, I'm happy to answer them as well.
Okay. Yeah, because I think that was one of the questions that we also got from Instagram. As we were kind of asking, like, okay, what kind of questions do you have for Pamela? And then another one, there's a question that says, like, how can you be mindful yet not be judged as meek or unassertive at work?
So that's a great question, right? And we just have this idea that being mindful means that we're not being assertive. They are definitely not. In some ways, they're not I mean, it's not mutually exclusive that you have to, if you're mindful, then you can't be assertive, you can't be a more powerful person. In fact, having that grounding of mindfulness gives you the confidence to go out there, speak your mind, and be okay with the response that comes through. And of course, it helps you not be a jerk, but that's, you don't need to be one in order to be assertive. So I don't know if that answers it, but I don't think being mindful would necessarily make you meek. In fact, it might make you more confident to be able to confront your fears around speaking up and doing those things. I certainly feel like mindfulness helps me be able to just speak my mind wherever I go.
Yeah, and I think one thing we also consistently hear is we're in an environment where we're continuously kind of encouraged and saying, oh, ask questions, you're supposed to ask questions, whoever can come up with questions quickly, right, faster.
Yeah.
But then it's like, but you just want to listen. You're not thinking about what question do I want to ask. You're thinking about just kind of, okay, let me just soak in the information and see, what the person has to say. So
yeah.
Another question, go ahead.
Yeah, just around that line, one thing I will say is, particularly when it comes to the more professional setting, sometimes you sort of have to make things up to ask. Otherwise, you don't want to be invisible. Just because you're just processing the information and you're actually not curious doesn't mean you don't ask questions. Because there are some things you have to do practically in workplaces in order to stand out, in order to demonstrate what you know. So one of the things that was very funny in retrospect, but we very much did it as a graduate student in philosophy department. And because I was in Harvard, I was surrounded by very smart people. And in the beginning, I didn't understand why people were asking these questions that were extremely long. They were not actually asking questions. Like at the end, there is no question. What they're doing is going off on tangents, trying to demonstrate what they know. And in some ways, I thought that was so unproductive. But later I found that it's a show you have to put on when you have put yourself into that role. You just have to do it. It's like giving an exam. It's like turning in a paper. Those kind of demonstrations we absolutely have to do. And particularly people who look like us, there's a certain stereotype that we are meek and we are perhaps not very powerful. So in some ways, in order to push that boundary and break that stereotype, perhaps we have to put in extra work to be more assertive and be seen more often. So I think that is something we absolutely have to play the part on a practical level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, balancing. Yes, navigating our way into the workplace as well. So, you touched a little bit on your academic, kind of your experience at Harvard. Another question that we got from Instagram, and then I can open it up to Q&A here, is if you can kind of help guide us through your career, or not career, but your academic journey. What was that like?
So it was definitely a very fun ride. I finished my college. I graduated college in 2.5 years. So I was not there too long. And right after that, I took a year off, and then I pretty much studied all the time in order to make myself at least appear qualified to even apply to Harvard. I did not have a philosophy background. There were a lot of languages that I needed to have as a requirement. I didn't have any of those. But what I knew was I had to work very hard. I studied a lot. And I also used the route of sort of making myself seen. So one of to be logistically exactly what I did, one example I'll give is I was reading this book called The Tibetan Book of the Dead by Robert Thurman. And when I read that, I thought, I'm going to go see him. I literally went to Columbia University, and he was a professor there. I waited outside his office, and I waited for him to come back to his office after his class. And I stopped him and I talked to him and told him that I'd love your book and I'd really love to study Buddhist philosophy. What is your suggestion? And who else to get a better suggestion from than him, right? And he said that Columbia doesn't have any money, so you would have to pay out of your pocket. And that was one requirement I had, is the education has to be free. I paid enough for my undergrad. I'm not going to pay anymore. So he said, go to Harvard. They have more money, and talk to the head of the Buddhist philosophy department and tell her that I told you about him. And then so I reached out to her, and through some other person, I really worked my network. So somebody else who was a student of this particular professor told me that she wrote a book, so it would be a wise idea to read her book. And then so when I talk to her, she knows that I'm interested in her, I'm interested in her work. So there's a reason for me to be her student. So using that kind of strategy of making yourself qualified, not only based on the grades, but also why Harvard and why under me? Because normally you're going to study under a professor. So you would have to sort of sell yourself in that way. So there's definitely that selling aspect and demonstrating what you have aspect, and also embellishing the little you have so that it looks more than it actually is. And once you go there, it's a whole lot of hard work.
Yeah, I think that's another area that we struggle with as well. You know, whatever we have, we don't really put it out there. We're kind of like, no, I don't have too much.
Yeah, absolutely. And I struggled with that a lot too, where people would say, oh, you're the expert. And I'd be like, no, but what is expert? Expert is such a subjective word. For somebody who knows less than me, I'm an expert. But with somebody who knows more than me, they are my expert. So in some ways, you sort of have to take that confidence route. And of course, humility is great, but we also have to be aware of where we stand in the world. And we are in a place where unless you confidently say that this is what I have and this is what I bring to the table, why would anybody believe you if you don't believe in yourself?
Yeah, definitely. And then, so we have a question now from the audience, and I'll just ask it. How can mindfulness come into play when dealing with peers at work who continuously undermine your role?
So that is a tricky one. I think one of the amazing things about mindfulness it allows you to have a certain level of internal locus of control. So you control how you feel rather than your environment controls how you feel. So you have that certain level of grounded place that you come from. And from that place, if we give up the resistance even just a little bit to the feeling of animosity we have towards our colleagues, in some ways things do ease up. And if they are just extremely terrible, then you just have to sort of not deal with them or find a way to minimize the amount of interaction you have with them. But mindfulness is what it's going to do is going to make you more resilient and understand that it's about them, it's not about you. And one example, which is sort of very far-fetched, but I'll give is once I was on a retreat, and it was a solo retreat in the mountains in Nepal where I was by myself, and I'm scared of darkness and I'm scared of spiders, especially when they are huge. So I was constantly so scared of the spider, that I spoke with my teacher and I told him that I'm so scared of the spider, I don't know what to do with it. And it was literally so bad that it was all consuming because it was just there and it was not going anywhere. And he said, practice compassion. And I was like, how's that going to help? But then it helps when you understand that this being is so much smaller than me. It's probably so much more scared than I am of the spider. And it has its own story, it has its own pattern. And when we think of the same way with other people, right, it's not so much you. We see the person with their face, but we don't see the background, the conditioning they've come through. We don't have to let them off the hook and let them behave terribly, but at the same time, having that compassion sort of puts things in perspective, and you know that it's not about you and it's about them. So practicing compassion is pretty powerful and very practical. And I'd suggest, even as an experiment, just see what happens if you do it for a week and things ease up, or at least you become less affected by it. Because, changing the world is it's not going to happen. There's an amazing quote by, I don't know exactly if it was by Bodhicharya Shantideva, but he says that spreading leather across the entire world is not possible, but you can wear shoes and it will protect your feet. So mindfulness helps you put on your shoes.
Thank you. That was a nice answer. And now I'll kind of open it up to anyone, if you want to unmute yourself, if you have any questions.
Okay, I have a question.
Okay, yes.
I actually have two questions. I'll just ask just one right now. Can you give us an example, a specific example of how meditation can help reduce implicit bias?
Yes. So meditation, with my implicit bias work, I don't really teach meditation, but more the mindfulness aspect. But even meditation, particularly when we think about it from the idea of exchange of self and others, what bias really does is it creates this idea of difference, where more and more we focus on the biased aspect of a person, they become more and more separate from us. But doing exactly the opposite and trying to see, sort of exchanging between self and others and seeing that they're actually just people who are trying just to feel okay and get by the day, just like I am, and then you see more and more of the similarity, it has that effect. I haven't taken that approach personally myself, but there have been some level of research on how loving kindness meditation, exchange of self and others, does reduce implicit bias, and they sort of examine that by a particular assessment tool called IAT, Implicit Association Test. And they found that the score in terms of how biased they were did go down. But in my work, I am more focused on deconstructing where the bias comes from so they can be aware of, and using mindfulness to constantly catch yourself. So before you react with the fear response, you take a moment to examine that and question it. Why? Why is this happening? And then they're able to come up with our own answer rather than giving them the answer. You know, when you calm down and ask yourself the question, your mind is able to hold your own.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think you had a question.
So you mentioned meditation and how to build mindfulness on that. I was wondering if you teach like during your training, or if you're aware of any like non-conventional way of developing mindfulness, because I feel like there's some times when, like, even like back when I was like working at the restaurant, like, you know, just sweeping, like sometimes that can be very mindful, like just trying to get all the dirt out, and like, I don't know. So I'm wondering if like some things like very like, you know, day-to-day tasks, like if we can consider that as mindfulness.
Yeah, absolutely. With meditation, it's a little bit different, but with mindfulness, you can certainly do it. You can, you know, there's an amazing Zen, I don't know if it's called koan or saying, I don't know what I would call it, but when a Zen master was asked, what is enlightenment? He said, it's when you eat and you sleep when you sleep. That's it. That's enlightenment. And with that, often, you know, whenever we think of the times that we are stressed out or we're not happy, it's because we are not where we are. We want to be somewhere else or be doing something else. So taking that approach of completely being in the present moment and doing what you're doing is actually a very beautiful way of practicing mindfulness. And it again goes back to that idea of monotasking. So if you're doing the dishes, feeling the texture of water in your hand, and for those of you who are Buddhist, you can even practice the Vajrasattva prayer and clear away your negative karma as you do it. There's so many amazing approaches that, particularly in Tibetan Buddhist, the Vajrayana tradition, it has been, the practices have been designed to work with the human psychology. So yes, that's very nice to sweep the floor mindfully, and it feels really good, and we're more effective, and the floor does look much cleaner when it's cleaned mindfully.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Please feel free to unmute yourself.
It is a daunting thing when you have been quiet for a while and you talk, and it's like sometimes you're, you know, so I understand the hesitance to speak. hesitation, I guess. It's not hesitance.
I have a question. So during this whole COVID pandemic right now, I think we're all sort of going through our own stuff and our own challenges. And I'm just wondering if, like, how specifically could we use mindfulness in sort of our day-to-day, you know, sort of frustrations with our situation, or, you know, like, how can we bring that into our daily life right now? Like, how specifically can we practice mindfulness?
Absolutely. So one thing I would suggest, although it is a little bit of work, is to practice meditation. And it's, you know, when you think of it, if you're driving a very fast car, you can't take a turn without stopping. Meditation is that stopping so that you can regroup and go into it. And when we really think about it from the wellness perspective, this idea of feeling threatened, we live in a time where everything is so uncertain, and literally you know, it is very uncertain. You go out for a walk, you could hurt yourself. So, and one of the parts in our brain that is responsible for ensuring that we are safe by constantly scaring us is amygdala. So with meditation, researchers found that just 8 weeks of meditation practice showed significant reduction, both in the size, the volume of amygdala, as well as the activity. And what that means in terms of practical benefit is, number one, we become less sensitive to the stressors in our environment. It's there. But how much it affects us is something we can control. Not so much control directly, but we can train our minds to be less sensitive to it. And another thing is, whenever we do feel that stress and anxiety, when the amygdala is not the most dominant aspect of your brain processing that information, you're able to cope with the whole anxiety better. And another practice outside of meditation is definitely gratitude. You know, at all times, we have things happening, and it's to some degree, we have the choice to focus on what we want to focus on. And for a lot of people, gratitude seems very woo-woo and Western, but I was taught by my teachers that, you know, before you go to sleep at night, just reflect on all the good things that happened. And it doesn't necessarily have to be this grand whatever thing, but the fact that, you know, we're alive and we're breathing, and that's the most important thing we need. We have that. That's a great thing. So to be able to focus on that really makes us more resilient, because attention is such an interesting thing that whenever we are focusing on things, naturally other things get unnoticed, because attention is a zero-sum game. So if we are not focusing on the positive thing, they are bound to get unnoticed. And what happens, we're constantly noticing only the negative things. And research has also found that humans, people, I can call us people, I guess, people spend more than 50% of our waking hours completely unaware of our mind wandering. And our more dominant aspect of what happens to our mind when we are mind wandering is focusing on a negative. Because of course, from the evolutionary perspective, it makes sense. What is the benefit of focusing on the good things? Nothing. Focusing on negative things makes sure that we are surviving. The beautiful sun and the beautiful plants doesn't do much, but when you focus on the little bit of the bush moving, that ensures our survival from a more evolutionary perspective. But now we don't live in a time when we have to constantly be on the lookout for the tiger jumping out of the bush. So we need to quiet that part of our brain and focus on the better things and practice meditation, and also thinking more in terms of others really takes the burden off of having to worry about ourselves.
I was also just reading this book earlier on intent, and one of the things it said there was on gratitude, and it said, you know, if you kind of get on that practice, the first day you'll maybe have like 1 or 2 things that you're going to add to that list. As you kind of continue that practice, you're just going to have endless amount of kind of list that you want to add, because as you're saying, that's where your attention is, that's where you're focusing. So you just tend to focus more and more of that, right? So
Absolutely.
Definitely. So we have a question from the audience. It says, so I'm unable to speak. Okay, so but how can we use mindfulness to stop comparing / competing ourselves with our coworkers? Can you explain that in a step-by-step mindset?
Yes. So comparison is one of the silliest way to rob ourselves of happiness and well-being. And mindfulness kind of might help you understand that, you know, every individual is its own individual. One person enjoying themselves, getting the, I don't know, promotion or going on vacation, when you really think about it, it has literally no implication on your own well-being. So thinking about it from that perspective, and not so much from the mindfulness perspective, but more from the perspective of compassion, just wanting them to be happy really lets you off the hook, where you don't feel like you need to have what they have in order to be well. And we live in a time where it's so much more accessible to compare ourselves. Back in the days, celebrities were actresses who, of course, we're not going to compare themselves to. Now it's this 18-year-old neighbor who's on, I don't know, Instagram doing things, and they're approachable. They seem like us, but perhaps they have all this, I don't know, better shiny things. So it's very much easier to compare ourselves and feel terrible about whatever is happening. I know that people say that, oh yeah, it's on social media, they only put the good things, so you shouldn't be unhappy that they are happy. But that's not a productive way to think about it. Let them be happy. Hope that they're actually happy even outside of the Instagram, and perhaps they're putting the mediocre moments on Instagram. So taking that attitude that may they be happy. And honestly, I know it sounds silly and it sounds not possible, but I read in one text, Bodhicharyavatara, and that was a very defining moment of my life when I was going through the early 20s and everything sucks and I hate everyone kind of phase. And there was this one part where it talked about how, you know, your enemies, I mean, they're not enemies, but just saying that enemies, the word enemies, are the biggest teacher you can have, because they teach you suffering and then they teach you how to overcome it. They teach you all these negative emotions come up, so you have the opportunity to work with it. And then in more philosophical text, there's always like a rebuttal, right? And then the other person says, why would I have to be grateful to my enemies? They didn't mean for me to grow. They just actually meant to hurt me. And then Shantideva says, exactly, if they actually meant to not hurt you and help you grow by being mean to you, you're not going to get offended, you know, then it won't work. So the fact that these students, these people exist, they should be sort of thought of as our teacher. And I know it's a far-fetched idea, but it's actually very, very practical. In fact, for me, during that age, I literally would do prostration. And every time I prostrated, I thought of anybody who I disliked or anybody who I felt somehow were hampering my happiness in whatever way. And I would imagine that I'm prostrating to them to the degree that perhaps if I actually saw them in real life, I'd be able to prostrate to them. And this is all, of course, happening in my head. Nobody knows what's happening outside. They don't care, you know, because at the end of the day, whenever you are angry with somebody else, you're jealous of them, they don't know. You're just torturing yourself. So thinking of it from a more functional and wise perspective, I don't know if I gave you step by step. You do not have to prostrate thinking about your co-workers, I promise, but just thinking about it from a more expansive, compassionate perspective is definitely going to help.
Yes. Okay, and then another question we have is, how can we do quick mindfulness in fight, fright, and freeze situation to deal with stage fright and other situations which arouse such situations?
Yeah, for this, I can give step by step. So one of the quickest and easiest way to access your parasympathetic nervous system is by breath. Whenever we are triggered, the first thing our body does is it mobilizes the stress hormones, and the breath gets shallow, and your heart beats faster. All you have to do is, your body is responding to your mind saying something is not okay, and your mind is speaking to your body saying something is not okay. So you can interrupt that by simply taking slow breaths. So you would breathe in through your nostril, and you don't have to be aggressive, just very slowly breathe in through your nostril, and then you can breathe for like 4 seconds. So for 4 slow seconds where you're sort of focusing on your nostril in there, and then the sensation of breathing in, and then you hold it in your belly for perhaps 6 seconds. You can literally count. and then breathe out for 8 seconds. And that triggers this really cool nerve called the vagus nerve. And that allows you to go into the parasympathetic mode where your mind knows, okay, I thought something was off, but it's not. Because it's constantly, our mind and body are interacting with each other, but we are so unproductive in the way we approach it. When we get scared, we scare ourselves more. So rather than going into that pattern, taking a pause and taking a deep breath, and if it's before giving a presentation or whatever it is, just taking that moment to do it. And even if you're in the middle of the presentation, you can always take a moment to stop and breathe. And we think that it might look awkward or weird, but it doesn't. You're creating some space for people to process what you said. And yeah, so you can simply take in a breath through your nostril for 4 seconds, hold it in your belly for 6 seconds, and breathe out through your nostril for 8 seconds. And then you're doing it very slowly and very consciously. If you do it 4 or 5 times, you'll see that you calm down enough that now you can access your smarter, wiser brain.
Thank you. And then we have another one in the chat box. So this one I think is more related also to the compassion point that you were making earlier. So just the context is every morning as I drive to work, I say my school prayers to ground myself and then to get myself ready to not be impacted by negativity at work, right? But it's always, with everything, it's easier said than done. So how can we continue to motivate ourselves so that this is helpful? How can we continue to motivate ourselves that this is helpful or needed? Yeah, this practice itself.
Yeah. So 2 things I'll say. In terms of feeling compassion for others, I know 100% it is very hard. Sometimes in Buddhism, they say that a compassionate feeling is like a flash in the sky where, it's a thunder, it lights up everything, but it's so momentary and it passes. Unless you grab it at that time and continuously practice it, it goes away. Teachers go into retreats and practice kindness meditation where literally they think about the suffering of people and what they have gone through and the agony they go through. When somebody is rude, we have been rude in our lives with our parents, with our partners, with our friends. Are we in a good place when we do that? Certainly not. We're suffering just as much. That's why we're trying this other person to suffer by lashing out. So thinking of that is important. And also, second thing is self-compassion. You sort of have to know that the kindest thing you can do for yourself right now in order to let yourself off the hook is to not get affected by it. And it's a practice. We have practiced feeling awful about things that happens in our environment for so long that, of course, within a week or 2 of thinking about compassionate thought is not going to correct it. Back home, great teachers go for retreats for 20 years and they were born as Rinpoches, and what are we? We don't stand a chance. So we have to be realistic about the growth that could possibly happen, but constantly choosing yourself and being self-compassionate, so doing what's productive for you is definitely important. And if you don't succeed at being compassionate towards another person, that's totally fine. You should just as much come into that sphere of compassionate feeling. So doing whatever is good for you is very important.
Thank you. There's another one. So this is, in Western academia, the research around mindfulness is relatively new and often limited in scope. So I'm curious, the person is saying, I'm curious about how you use your proximity to Buddhism to learn more about what mindfulness is.
So in terms of the research on the mind and mindfulness, luckily for us, more and more Buddhist scholars who have the grounding of the Dharma practice are now participating, like Miguel Rinpoche or the Dalai Lama or Matthew Ricard. And it's amazing that these people can bring in so much more than I could potentially even fathom as a hypothesis. So what was the question? I kind of lost my train of thought.
So essentially, it's kind of how you're using your proximity to Buddhism to learn more about what mindfulness is.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you. So that is, in a way, it's a little bit fortunate for me because I don't know much, but I know what to look for. I know enough to know what to look for. And same with the research aspect. I don't know too much, but I know enough to know what are reliable sources, who are the researchers, what are the labs that I could be looking out for in terms of getting the information. So a lot of times I do have a certain level of question in my mind, and then I narrow my search based on that. I don't know if that answered the question. I'm finding a trend here.
I think it kind of does. It's like having this insider information, insider information, in terms of looking at when you're doing your research and stuff too. Any other questions? I know I think I touched on all the ones that we have in the chat box.
Can I just add on to my question really quickly?
Yeah.
I'm curious about like who or what you went to within like the Buddhist wisdom to learn more about mindfulness.
So one of the things for me, thank you. One of the things that has been very productive for myself is the study of epistemology, pramana. I don't know if you all know Dharmakirti's school. And with that, having this idea of sort of examining not only the external things, but examining the tools. So one example is, we are constantly weighing ourselves, let's say, but let's examine what it means. Like, who knows, like this machine might be broken. So taking that approach of, and I actually use the similar aspect of Dharmakirti's pramana in order to also sort of deconstruct bias, both the formation of it, and hence then we can deconstruct it. So I sort of draw from that school a lot as I think about what makes up mindfulness, what makes up unmindfulness. So that has definitely been a paradigm that I use a lot. And also in terms of Buddhist philosophy, of course, the school of Madhyamaka, being from a Nyingma school myself, that's what I have personally been trained in. So I use that approach in seeing how that sort of translates into our understanding of the world and how that has shaped our brain the way it is, and then sort of going from that angle. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much.
And along those lines, so I wanted to just ask Pamela if you could provide us with a list of recommended books.
Yes, of course. I think I've already thrown that name Bodhicharyavatara more times than it was welcome, but Bodhicharyavatara is definitely a very dear book. And if anybody, particularly if you are struggling with being around people who you can't stand or they're not very kind, that book really is very practical and productive, particularly the chapter on patience. There are several translations of it. I think the one from Shambhala publication is the one I studied, and also one by Crosby. I can't remember the first name, but the last name is Crosby. He also has commentaries with the translation, and that's very helpful. Another book that is very close to my heart, again, is His Holiness's The Four Noble Truths. That's a very beautiful book. It really explains, it's like such a great place to start and really working with it rather than just going through it, but after each page sort of stopping and saying, what did it say and how does it apply to my life? This is really great. And then when you've read all of that, I don't know if you all know Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche's text called Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism is a really great book. It's quite dense, as with all of Chogyam Trungpa's scholarship, but it's a really good one.
Thank you. Chimpe, you had a question?
Yes. So this question is more of an academic curiosity, I guess. So when it comes to like a single pointed concentration meditations, I've had like a couple of teachers tell me, so when you focus on something, like don't focus too hard. Does neuroscientific research support that idea? If so, like what's going on, like from neuroscientific perspective, like?
So that's a great question. And in that way, I would say that the aspect of research hasn't gotten there in terms of examining different kinds of meditation and things of that nature. Normally, most of the research done are either on transcendental meditation or the one where there's just loving kindness meditation as well as just breath meditation. And I guess that would be considered single pointed focus. So in terms of focusing on one thing at a time, one research that might be worth mentioning is the one where Matthew Ricard was involved. And what he found was when you're focused on a single pointed meditation, although there was no
very strictly being, it looks like my earplugs went out of charge. Can you hear me? Okay. So that in that research, what he found, or what they found, the team found, was whenever we are focusing on one point, naturally, because the dominant aspect is that distraction is the dominant part, we naturally get distracted. And whenever we get distracted, we might notice, oh, I've been thinking about other things and not meditation. So when we do that, it triggers parts of the brain. Literally, they found parts of the brain activated. And one of them was insula, and the other one was, I think, anterior cingulate. But don't hold me accountable if I'm wrong. But insula is definitely it. But anterior cingulate, I can't be 100%, although I'm 85%. And then the job here, once you notice that you have gotten distracted, is to now bring your awareness back to your breath. And that's called reorienting awareness. And when you do that, you trigger the frontal cortex and the parietal lobe. And what happens is, naturally with training, when we keep meditating long enough, we are able to have less and less of those moments when we get distracted. And that continues to trigger and activate the prefrontal cortex, which has huge implication on emotional regulation, impulse control, and sustaining focused attention. So that's the approach they took when it came to examining what happens in those few separate moments of meditation. But in terms of how tightly we have to stay focused, I think it comes more from the Dharma perspective, where the Buddha apparently said that, you know, to a guy who plays sitar, when he asked him, how should I meditate? He asked him, you know, you're a sitar player, should the strings be very tight? And he said, no, that wouldn't make a good sound. Or should it be very loose? And he was like, no, that would not make good sound either. So then what should you do? So it's the same balance where you are aware, your awareness is there to the extent, I like to say that you just want to know that you're breathing in when you're breathing in, you know that you're breathing out when you're breathing out. As long as you know that, it does not have to be any more than that. And then whenever you get distracted, you know that you have gotten distracted, and that's fine. If you know you don't catch yourself for a while and then you catch yourself, it's just something about a practice. But yeah, staying very focused, it just doesn't do it.
Got it. Okay. So there's another question in the chat box. You mentioned making prostrations to your enemies. I wonder if you do that in the context of Ngondro practice, and if that also was an advice of your teacher or the instructions or commentary of your Ngondro, and if you recommend us to do the same. I think that's what it is.
So so yes and no. So with my Ngondro practice, there was definitely a lot of frustration involved, to the extent that one night I was lying down and I put my hands under my head to fall asleep. Literally, my biceps was so strong that I couldn't curl up very well. And that's, yeah, so I had to process it a lot. So that was definitely a huge part of Ngondro. But this one came much before, where I needed to sort of train my brain myself. But in Ngondro practice, yes, definitely there is a lot of prostration involved in prostrating to your quote unquote enemies or anybody who you dislike. In fact, you put your parents beside you, and you know, you put your enemy even in front of you. So that's definitely practice of it. With Ngondro, I personally absolutely recommend it, particularly if we are trying to get higher level of initiations or empowerment. Ngondro is a preliminary practice that is sort of prerequisite. So it's the 101. If you're a psych major, you have to do one-on-one in order to go to the capstone. So we absolutely you have to do it if you are thinking of growing and getting formal instructions from teachers. And in terms of actually doing it, I just took off and did a retreat where that's what I did all day. So that's why it was possible. If I did it in a context of being home and working, it would definitely be challenging. But like with anything, if you have the right instruction and right guidance, doing it morning and evening, I think would definitely be possible. But for that, you definitely have to speak with a teacher, because it's like a whole process of getting initiation, and there are different lineages through which you can do Ngondro practice. One text that talks about Ngondro in a really amazing way is Kunzang Namishalung, which is in English translation is the words of my perfect teacher. So that talks about all the aspects. And this one is from the lineage of, it's a Nyingma lineage, but I don't know exactly who that would be. Patrul Rinpoche's lineage, if you all know Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, it would be that lineage. And you would need somebody from that lineage to give you the initiation and give you the instructions. So I was lucky that I was able to go back home and speak with my teachers, get initiation from my teacher, and get instructions. So it's an elaborate process, but definitely something whoever wants to study Buddhism seriously would probably have to do it.
And maybe like for those of us who are on the call but don't necessarily know what Ngondro practice is, if you could give a quick overview.
Yes, absolutely. So Ngondro, it's, if you translate it, it's the preliminary practice. And the way it starts is sort of laying a foundation. You, in the beginning, start by turning your mind to Dharma, they say, you know, thinking about how life is so precious, and just reveling on the fact that life is so precious, it's so amazing, and we have the fortune of having the leisure, we have the brain that actually works, we can read, we have the time to actually take off, we don't have to work all day, all night. So thinking about all those luxuries of being alive. And then second, thinking about how impermanent it is. And, you know, particularly with COVID-19, it is super impermanent. We can't rely on the fact that we are gonna, next year I'll do Ngondro. It might not happen. It will happen, but it might not happen. I don't want to sound very morbid, but thinking about the impermanence. And then third, thinking about how constantly we are accumulating negative karma. If you go into studying the extent to which we have access to accumulating negative karma, and it's just almost scary that anything we do can create negative karma, and we are in a chain where there's no free lunch. Everything we do has a consequence from the karma perspective. So when you really meditate on that, you realize that there is literally no refuge, nowhere to go except for dharma. So you go into that idea with that very strong conviction that you want to study the dharma and go for refuge. So the first part is then just frustration. And normally the traditional number that one approaches is 100,000. So you do 100,000 prostration, and you have your prayers where you're just going for refuge. And then the second aspect, and normally you would, I guess I don't have to go through the whole process, but you'll do one thing and then you'll do everything else every day, but you're focused on one thing at a time. And the second one is generating compassionate hearts. So during that time, you're constantly praying and thinking about all the animals and human beings who are suffering, and we don't need to suffer. We are actually inherently, we have the capacity to be happy, but because we are so ignorant, we suffer. So we contemplate on that and meditate a lot. And then we do the Vajrasattva practice where we are eliminating our negative karma, and that as well as other people and other sentient beings. And then there's Guru Yoga, where you are calling out to your Guru so that the Guru can sort of guide you and you can mingle with your Guru. And there's a certain practice where you envision your Guru a certain way. And normally, I think, particularly in the Tibetan book, the Words of My Perfect Teacher, there is the aspect of Chö, but we don't actually do Chö because it's a pretty intense practice that now maybe teachers have taken out, but in that text there is aspect of Che and Poa, which is both like quite intense practices. So those are the.
Thank you. So maybe we have time for a couple more questions if anyone has any.
I have a question. So I was just wondering, like, going back to like mindfulness and how to apply that to workplace. Like, I feel like our like these days issue is not so much like having an enemy or like having really strong negative emotions. It's more like being complacent, not finding motivation, and just not being ambitious. So I was wondering how you can apply mindfulness to, you know, to counter that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, I'm a huge procrastinator, and that's, if I have to say like one huge source of my suffering, procrastination is it. And so you can definitely use mindfulness, but not so much exactly just in a sense of mindfulness, but you can use mindfulness in order to do those focused work. But there are other things which are mindful ways of being in life, but not so much directly with mindfulness. But what it entails is planning your day right, starting in the morning. And honestly, this is something outside of the mindfulness meditation aspect, something I've been doing in the morning, because now it's so dark and everything's gloomy and you can't really inspire yourself, especially where you're working in your pajamas. I'm always like only wearing a nice shirt and wearing my pajamas. So it's really hard to take yourself seriously, right? So doing morning exercises and literally getting your body pumped up is so important. And another thing that I've started doing is right after I shower with warm water, I'll turn it completely cold, and that really wakes you up, especially when we don't have to leave the house, we are home. We need to add in those routine to rejuvenate ourselves and make ourselves feel alive, and giving ourselves the restriction of time where for a certain period of time you do the work. So if you have a work hour of 8 hours, but you actually don't have to work for 8 hours, maybe trying to compress it in a way that you are getting more done in shorter periods of time, so that you can go for an afternoon walk when it's light out, as opposed to at 5 p.m. when it's dark and who wants to go out anyways. So doing those kind of things more than just mindfulness would help you develop ambition. And another thing that I've really found that helps me, particularly when I'm in a rut and I'm not feeling very ambitious, is reading autobiographies or biographies of people who have achieved so much, because they had the same 24 hours. We have the same 24 hours. We can really utilize it. And it's not just about the ambition or performance aspect of it. When we are not performing, we don't feel very happy. And so thinking of it from that perspective, I think would make sense. Did that answer your question, or did you have more specific questions around that?
Yeah, it kind of does. So it seems like more like not only just on mindfulness, but also, you know, paying attention to routine and that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and definitely moving your body a lot, because especially now it's dark and we're home, so we don't have too much need to move our bodies around. So creating that routine of moving is going to be very important. The winter of COVID-19.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then maybe one last question, if we have from the audience. Wait a little bit more. Okay, so if no questions, then I think we're running, or and Tenzin Yuma, did you have a question?
Oh, yeah, I was just gonna ask, I'm kind of thinking over this question myself, but wanted to know how you balance working with mindfulness, the concept of mindfulness within the Western capitalist environment, while also acknowledging that the roots of mindfulness comes from Buddhism, and it was not intended for this kind of use. Yeah, just how do you kind of navigate that?
That is a great question, because I've definitely struggled with that aspect. And that's why I was in scholarship. And I thought that was a more integrity-based approach to engaging with the topic of mindfulness. But one of the things that due to the guidance from my teachers, what I learned is the intended use of mindfulness and meditation is to alleviate suffering. Whether it's a corporate CEO who is high performing, or somebody who is back home in Nepal just going for Kora all day just to feel that sense of alleviation of suffering. So definitely that aspect is there. In fact, I struggled that more in my personal life, more so than the fact that, you know, meditation and mindfulness is not meant to be used in this context. Because, you know, when you run a business, of course, you get more and more ambitious, and the little success you see, the more success you want, and staying focused on, because in Dharma, they always say that, you know, the samsaric goals and Dharma goals don't coincide. So it's a balance that I am trying to achieve. Also the balance that I honestly love samsara. Like it's good. When things are good, it's very good. It's very hard to think, oh, it's all bad. So I'm very much in it. So I'm constantly learning and thinking about it. One thing that my teacher taught me, which was the kindest thing he probably said to me, was, you know, there's nothing in life that is worth taking too seriously, even the Dharma. Of course, sincerity is required. Sincerity is required, but there's no need to take things too seriously. And I know that I fall under that tendency of taking things very seriously. So I now feel more and more okay with the work I'm doing and the people I'm serving, because people come back and say, my kids are feeling more okay around me, or I feel, you know, today my kids were taking a bath and I was able to be there without thinking about other things. And for me, I can't think of anything better I could do with my time. So I do feel that sense. But again, yeah, that is true, where definitely meditation and mindfulness is used in this capitalistic world to achieve more and to rule the world. And so yeah, it is a hard balance, and I don't have an answer. I am dealing with it more on the personal level of not being so greedy and not being so ambitious, more so than thinking about the service that I'm providing to. I have more problem than the people I'm serving.
I have a final question. Sorry about asking too many questions. So I have a niece, like a teenage niece, that is constantly on, let's say, TikTok, you know, going from one video to another, like almost like 24/7. Yeah. So how do you, like, do you have any practical tips as to like, how do you get her off that and like be more mindful?
Yes. So one thing I will say is, it's so sad for kids younger in age, they haven't seen a world outside of this. So it's very hard when you're in it. I haven't seen it personally myself, but there's a documentary called Social Dilemma. I hear that it's really puts people in their place and gets them scared. So that's one approach. And I don't know how much control you have over how she spends her time, but you know, so many times I personally found for myself, taking things away doesn't work. Adding things work. So rather than saying, I'm not going to be without my phone, saying I'm going to go for a walk, or I'm going to instead read on a physical paper book. So adding things to do and takes away from that time of constantly mindlessly being on the phone. So helping create that hygiene could be good by creating some boundary. Especially, I don't know, niece, I don't know how much control you would have over her routine, but making her watch Social Dilemma might scare her somewhat, at least, because people don't even think it's a problem. So that is the bigger problem, that they don't even think it's a problem. And TikTok is especially so bad. at least, I don't know, others, I'm actually not on social media. I'm talking so much about social media, but I'm not even on social media very much. I'm only on LinkedIn, which is not fun, so it doesn't hurt. But in terms of TikTok, it's like the videos, they go so quickly that your attention, you're constantly looking for the new thing. Actually, there was one research done where these little rats, which is sad, but these little rats, what happened is each time they pressed a button, it would give them a dose of dopamine. And it felt good. Dopamine is the feel-good chemical. They kept pressing it to the extent that they died of starvation and thirst. They had the food, but they wouldn't go get it. So in some ways, we are that. Those hit of new videos with flashy colors gives us dopamine hit. So even though we're not doing anything, we feel this sense of, feels good. So we are addicted to it. So people think, oh, just keep your phone away. We should sort of think of it as a bigger problem and understand that there is a dopamine addiction going on, and it will require some kind intervention than just saying, oh, put your phone away. It's going to take some time to get there. But Social Dilemma might be a good place to start.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that will be all for the questions. And, before I pass it off to Odin, I just, again, want to say thank you so much, Pamela, for taking the time, and then for everyone who's here in the audience. So, Nanu.
Can you guys see my screen? Oh, okay. So yeah, I think this session was really good. So thank you so much, Pamela, for making the time today to share us your knowledge. I think definitely having someone from the youth and also having someone from from our community, I guess like the Himalayan community, it's really great to hear the Eastern perspective as well as a little bit of incorporating the Western way of thinking into this. And I think for us, the youth and whoever else, I think it's really beneficial. So thank you so much for that. I think so. The next thing I just wanted to mention was thank you all for joining, to all the participants. I'm sure most of you heard of us through our social media account, but I'll still just put it out there to please follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at Online Tibetan Education. We do have today's session recorded, and it will be on YouTube shortly. So yeah, please follow us. And then I also sent a feedback link on the chat. So if everyone could provide their feedback, we try to create or to put together an event every Lhakar that's related to religion, language, Tibetan religion, Tibetan language, and culture. So something similar to this. So if you guys have any ideas on what you would like to to see in the future, please provide us your feedback. And I think with that, we will end today's session. So thank you all. Thank you all for attending today.
Thank you, everyone. You've been a very fun crowd.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. We've had a lot of really good questions too, Ra.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll stop the recording.